So I have a role that I normally don't play, was being a moderator, and I'm usually not viewed as moderate. So, but I will try to play the role of moderator here. The subject obviously has gotten a lot of attention. Protectionism was a very big role in the U.S. election, and concerns about openness played a role in the Brexit, and a lot of is playing a role in a lot of the European elections. So it's a big topic to cover in a little over an hour. So rather than, I thought, focusing on the past and how we got to this miserable place where we are, where we're all fighting with each other, I thought we would try to take a little bit more forward-looking view, but at least maybe to begin with, and part of that is forward-looking view. There have been a lot of statements of the administration of what they want to do, renegotiate the trade agreements. I can't help but mention, he's said, in effect, the president said in effect that our trade negotiators got snookered. And I've watched these trade negotiations for a very long time very closely. And my view is our trade negotiators never got snookered. They got 95% of what they wanted. He may complain about what they wanted, and they may have wanted the wrong thing, but it wasn't that the other side got the better of our trade negotiators. So the real issue in some way is what do we want, and what should we be trying to get? And the concern is the direction that the administration is pushing one that will lead to making things better, or will it actually make not only the Rust Belt workers who were the source of the unhappiness, but businesses worse off? Are there alternative policies going forward that will actually work and address some of the grievances and promote economic growth? So that's the thrust. I'll try to reserve some time towards, at the end we'll have some time for questions, but a little bit before that, if we haven't discussed it, we should have a little time on the border adjustment tax, because that's a big deal that will affect businesses a lot. So maybe, if I could, let me just begin by asking each of you to give a little bit of a view of how you see the current situation, how the proposals that you've heard are likely to affect your particular industry, auto, your innovative design. So each might just go across down the line. And last, I asked Bruce to give a global view. Bruce has been writing about this subject for a very long time. Bruce and I do a course at the an EMBA course on globalization and market. So we've been talking about these issues for 15 years, and we actually talked about, we saw all this coming in many ways. So we talked about all these problems, the impact it was having on inequality and on how markets work. So we've been talking about, so I'll ask Bruce to sort of give an overview after he hears all the perspectives from the business and labor. Okay, can I?
Sure. So I'll start. So, if you're going to talk about trade, you have to talk about automobiles. We export more automobiles and parts from the United States than anything else. It's about $140 billion a year in exports. And our member companies, which in my case would be Fiat Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, are real practitioners of free trade. We've learned how to maximize trade flows and free trade agreements, and automobiles are a heavily traded commodity. And just to give you an example, in the NAFTA, about a fourth of the NAFTA trade is automotive trade. So we believe that it's important for the administration to really be thoughtful as they approach this. We're an industry that in a lot of ways is probably better aligned with the current administration than others. For a long time, we've called for a more forceful response to foreign currency manipulation, which the president talks about a great deal. We think the Europeans have been far more aggressive in pushing for acceptance of their automobile standards than the United States has. So we believe you can improve U.S. trade policy. Even in the case of NAFTA, which we would argue is a very effective agreement. It's helped North America be a really effective export platform and competitive globally. Even in the case of NAFTA, we'd be supportive of a renegotiation. There's lots of things that we include in free trade agreements today that we didn't include a quarter century ago, such as labor and environmental standards. So we're optimistic about the future in terms of U.S. trade policy, but also think it's extremely important that the administration and our negotiators be really thoughtful as they approach these policy issues, because it is very, very easy to have unintended consequences in these negotiations. And the administration, for example, is very focused on the rule of origin in NAFTA. And what you do on the rule of origin in NAFTA could have tremendous ramifications for the ability to utilize the free trade agreement and for the United States and for North America to be competitive, at least in the automotive sector.
Beth?
Yeah, well, first I always feel like I need to describe Land O'Lakes and why I would even be in this conversation. So Land O'Lakes, everybody knows our butter, right? Yes, our dairy products, of course. Butter's back, yay, healthy. Love it. But the reality is that Land O'Lakes is a farmer-owned co-op, and actually probably 2/3 of our $13 to $15 billion, depending on commodity prices, are in the ag sector. It's Purina Animal Nutrition is our platform, and Winfield Solutions that was referenced by an earlier speaker. And so I would speak about the trade from the perspective of agriculture. As trade is central to agriculture, 13% of corn production was exported last year. 1 in 7 days of a dairy producer's production was exported last year. It's worth billions of dollars and a number of jobs in the United States. Agriculture is a net exporter, and so it's a positive. And so go back to this unintended consequence. NAFTA and the discussion around NAFTA has driven tremendous concern and variability in commodity markets. You already have length around the world. There's excess dairy production, grain production is long, and to have a trade disruption, especially for key markets, and Mexico is a key market for corn, it's a key market for dairy products, that is a significant issue. Do we see an opportunity to renegotiate? Well, always, there's always an opportunity, but actually a lot of our focus in dairy especially would be on Canada and market different strategies that the Canadian government has employed that has reduced our ability to access the Canadian market. In fact, just this past week, what has occurred is that they've put up a new class of milk for dairy ingredients, and it advantages their producers and processors. It means that a lot of that production and a lot of the imports that we had been, or that they had been doing from the upper Midwest were pushed back into the upper Midwest, and that has a direct on-farm implication for dairy producers. We're in the middle of what's called flush. That is peak production time for a dairy producer. It's when the cows are producing the most milk, and there are reduced outlets. And to have that dairy production then come back means, in this instance, many processors have said, I can't take your milk, dairy producer, and because I can't take it, what is the outlet? And during flush, there are no outlets. So it has a direct on-farm implication for a dairy producer. So from an ag perspective, trade is key, and it's driving tremendous contention and variability in an already long marketplace. So speed and getting some clarity as to what the path forward is going to be centrally important.
Bruce?
So I'm the one who supplied that beautiful broom to Mitchell in the beginning of the conference, and he did a great job demonstrating it. So my company, we produce cleaning products and kitchen products. We innovate here in the U.S., and we produce all over around the world. I feel like the bad guy sometimes because I guess people think that because I import and I produce outside the United States that I'm not a good person or whatever. I feel really bad, but I wrote an op-ed due to that. So there's a difference between my company than what offshoring is. Like, I started 30 years ago by bringing over product from Europe that was very trendy and very right for the US that we weren't doing here. It was produced in Italy, produced in Germany, and the US market was so ripe for these kind of commodity products that was not being produced here. I found a niche in the market, and then we started producing product and making product in Europe and bringing it here. Due to foreign exchange fluxes, in the year 2000, I started producing product in China. So, what we do here, and what's really important is that, like Apple Computer, we're a tiny bit smaller, but we innovate, we create jobs. I have product developers, I have graphic artists, I have 40 people in a warehouse. We assemble product. We go where it's best to produce product. And I think that that's what's great about this country. It gives the best from around the world. And for example, we produce plastic buckets in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Who would think? But you can't make a bucket in China, the freight's too high. So broomsticks, for example, are made mostly in Italy. There's no broomstick factories in the United States, so someone has to import. We can make plastic here. So that's the big thing that I think the administration just does not understand, is that that train has left. There are no factories here to produce. I can't find a factory to produce, to put bristles into a piece of plastic. We searched high and low, and it does not exist. We can't find a broomstick manufacturer. So trade is really important, and very nervous what's going on, and I really believe in free trade.
Okay. Bruce?
I don't. So the consensus on free trade that has existed for 50 years between Democrats and Republicans is finally over, I believe, and something will come in its place. And the reason it's over, and Joe asked not to focus on the past, but the reason it's over is because of the consequences of mishandled trade treaties. The result of it, massive job loss, massive disruption to many of the towns and communities in America, and the way of life in these towns and communities, that has resulted in massive dislocation. It's not simply an American problem, it's a global problem. We saw it in the Brexit vote in the UK, we see it in the French elections, we see it all over Europe. And fundamentally, it's driven by the growth in income inequality. And so when I don't agree with much of what the current administration says about almost anything, but in the one area, I think there's a lot of sensible discussion, is how to renegotiate these trade treaties. So for instance, and I believe that the political reality is they will be renegotiated. The agreement that we call NAFTA was done between two high-wage developed countries with sophisticated and fairly powerful trade union movements, and a third country with no free trade union movement. It's a phony trade union movement, low wages, and nothing was done. There was no transition to bring the wages and conditions to force Mexico to agree to free and fair trade unions and allow Mexican workers to raise the wages in their country. I think that when we look to the future, we're going to have to see these trade treaties redone, and I hope that the president does some of the things that he says he's going to do. And I also think that it's foolishness to believe that no one believes, including the labor movements around the world, that trade shouldn't exist. It's a question of what kind of trade. It's a question of what are the conditions between the countries that trade, and some kind of fair trade regimen instead of the free trade that's existed. And one other final point is that it's not simply, in my mind, the sentiment of workers and their organizations, but it's the sentiment of the population. The American consumer desires products made in the United States as other people do in other countries. And when I hear the argument, forgive me, but when I hear the argument, because I've been representing manufacturing workers my whole life. When I hear the argument that we don't have the factories anymore to produce it, that's sort of like the, guy murders his parents and then wants mercy because he's an orphan. We have destroyed much of the industries that we need to produce the products that could be produced here. It's not about technology. Some of it is about education of our workforce. Some of it is about trade legislation. And some of it is about an even playing field. And what I believe is that this consensus is not coming back. There'll be something to replace it. And this time, hopefully, we'll get it right. And it's not going to be a Democrat, in my mind, versus a Republican debate, but it's going to be a bipartisan discussion of just as it was in NAFTA, if you remember that debate, it was the more liberal Democrats and the right-wing Republicans that opposed NAFTA, and it was the pro-business Democrats and the pro-business Republicans that passed it along with a pro-business Democratic president. I think that we're going to see another odd consensus on trade, and let's hope that the next round of treaties and the renegotiation of the existing treaties gets it right in a much better way for American and global workers.
Okay, I'm actually going to agree with people, which I try never to do as a matter of principle. But so let me just start with, I want to make 3 points. Let me start with historical perspective. The polarization is not going away. We have seen this movie before. And it's a movie where an industry that not only has huge economic importance, but has huge sort of social importance and a huge imaginative role in American society just dies. And it doesn't die because anybody has done anything wrong. It dies because productivity growth is 5 to 7% a year and demand growth is 2 to 3% a year. The last time that happened was in the Depression. And the industry that died, and you're hearing a little bit of sort of the vestigial consequences of that death that died globally, was agriculture. Farmers were very important to a sense of American society. They were very important to a sense of German society. They were very important to a sense of European society. And as those jobs disappeared, everybody tried to export their way out of the problem because they couldn't support that sector on domestic demand alone. And you had a very difficult trade environment because one country can export their way out of the problem. When you add up overall countries, the exports and the imports have to be zero. The world can't export its way out of the problem. So you had this very difficult trade environment in the Depression. What's dying today, and again, it has the same kind of resonance, the idea of people, and I'll be honest about this, mostly men, making things, is manufacturing. But manufacturing is dying for exactly the same reason. Productivity growth is high, and global demand growth for manufacturers is much lower. And it is technology. I mean, you can go back and decompose the loss of manufacturing jobs into a loss to exports or imports and a loss to productivity growth. Over the last 40 years where this has been happening, 80% of it has been lost to productivity growth. 20% at most has been lost to exports. And that productivity growth is not going away. People are still going to try and save manufacturing jobs because they play an important cultural role for generations who are committed to them and are trained for them, and it's going to be hard to retrain them in various ways. But they're not going to change things, and that's what I think you have to understand, and is the second point I want to make. As manufacturing jobs go away to automation, and it's the robots that are the real threats, the trade problem is also going to go away. Because remember, what's driving trade is low-cost labor overseas. As the labor goes away, and I want to give an example of automobiles to show you how dramatically this has happened, the value of low-cost labor goes away, and the manufacturing comes back to the United States. It's just the jobs don't come back to the United States. When General Motors got in trouble in 1980-81, General Motors had 360,000 employees in North America. When they got in trouble in 08, 09, they had 30,000 employees in North America. And they produced half as many cars. That's where the action is. And they're still going down. So whatever the government tries to do, it's not going to save these jobs, but that's not going to stop the effort. So that's the second thing I think you have to keep in mind. Manufacturing is coming back to the developed world. You're starting to see it, mostly, by the way, in places like China that are facing increasing headwinds in this global world. And that's the third point I want to make. The United States has a terrific propensity to concentrate on our own hangnails when people overseas are bleeding to death. Manufacturing, that is export-led growth, has been the successful development model. In the context of the sort of thing you heard in the last session on demand for food and manageable global growth, population growth is a huge part of that. To get population growth down, all the evidence is you've got to develop the less developed world. If the export-led growth model disappears because manufacturing disappears from the developing world, you're not going to get that development. And that is going to have devastating global consequences. So actually, I think the concern here is not for manufacturing in the United States. As I say, historically, you can understand why it's happening, but it's not going to make any difference that these forces of technology, of the trend in demand of services, which is another huge part of it, are going to drive local production. But in the world as a whole, the health of a developing global economy is going to be substantially impaired, and I think we don't want to make that worse by these kinds of trade interventions.
Okay, so let me try to reemphasize some of the things that Bruce said and link it to what others have said, and then ask the next round to get some interaction. The important point that Bruce emphasized is that no matter what Trump does, the manufacturing jobs are not coming back. And we have to put it in perspective. Manufacturing was only, in recent years, 8–9%. So even if it came back, increased by 25%, that's 2%. It's not a huge amount. So we have to keep in perspective. For the industries, it's important. But from the national economy, it's a relatively small, in our image of what we teach in our textbook of production is manufacturing, but it's not the economy today. There are important manufacturing industries, but still it's not where the vast majority in solving it, and we're not going, no matter what happens in our trade agreement, it won't affect that. The second thing that I thought Bruce was going to come to was the president talked about the trade deficit. He talked about the trade deficit with NAFTA. He doesn't mention very much that we have a trade surplus with Canada. And the way they handle that is they say, well, some of that is trading services, and trading services is not like trading goods. And that's going back to, again, this 19th century, early 20th century, that goods and services are really different. Real men produce goods, not services. And the point, of course, is Columbia feels very strongly about this. Exports of education services is a big deal. We have a very large fraction of our student body is from tourist services, are a big industry in New York. Financial services are a big export industry. So services are really where 70% of the U.S. economy is in services, and yet we aren't, and we make a lot of money from the export of services. So in terms of NAFTA, we have a deficit with Mexico, but a trade surplus with Canada, but a lot of that is in services. Those are just as valid. And there is a real disservice in trying to say, well, services and goods are not the same. But in terms of what any economist would talk about, what matters is not the bilateral trade deficits. I say the bilateral trade deficit with China, the bilateral trade deficit with Mexico. What matters is the multilateral trade deficit. Money was invented to avoid barter, so we didn't have to have a balance of payments with each person. And so we have money now, we have a multilateral system, and it's the multilateral trade deficit that matters. And here, the basic lesson of macroeconomics is that the multilateral trade deficit depends on our balance between domestic investment and domestic savings. When domestic savings is low, we have to borrow from abroad, and the counter side, the flip side of that borrowing, the capital inflow, is the statement that we're importing more than we're exporting, the trade deficit. So if, as the administration has proposed, there will be a large reduction in taxes and maybe an increase in expenditures, the national deficit will go up, the fiscal deficit will go up, and the counterweight of that is almost certainly the trade deficit is going to go up. So no matter what he says about trade agreements and all that, the trade deficit, the multilateral trade deficit is going to go up. So how does that play in with renegotiating the trade agreements? Well, the mechanism by which this occurs is through the exchange rate. And every Secretary of Treasury and every president has a painful experience in learning that he can't order the exchange rate to be what he wants it to be. Now, I remember, when I was in the Clinton administration, every once in a while somebody would say they're going to try to talk the dollar up. It was when we were Japan. For some reason, the dollar-yen went way down, and we thought it was a bad thing for us to have a weak dollar. Now we think it's a good thing, but it was a bad thing to have a weak dollar because it was saying that the world thought America was a weak country. I kept saying, well, weak dollar doesn't mean a weak country. Those are just, it's a price. But anyway, so the Secretary of Treasury tried to talk it up, and you find you can talk it up for a few minutes, sometimes for a few seconds, but not for very long. And that is the mechanism by which this multilateral trade deficit gets accomplished. And when you have more protectionism, all it means is the exchange rate will adjust even more. Now, in the next panel, you're going to talk about where the future of the world is going to go. A significant increase in the exchange rate is a threat to the world economy because there are a lot of countries who borrow money in dollars and have their income in domestic currency. The value of the dollar goes up. It's a big disturbance. How big is another question, but it is a potential major disturbance. So I want to go into the next set of questions given where we are, and the issue is not just the employment and manufacturing, but the broader issue of the inequality, and trade is part of the inequality. I think it's a bigger part than Bruce does, but that
Too many Bruces, you gotta.
The distinguishing part of this panel is that there are 3 Bruces on this panel. So I don't have to remember names very well. All I have to do is say Bruce. Anyway, how is there so part of the underlying problem is employment of a particular group of people who've lost their jobs. And another particular problem is this huge increase in inequality, which is bigger than the particular people who've lost their jobs. It's a broader societal phenomena. Do any of you have any reflections of how we can redo trade in a way that addresses these two big issues? So, can I begin with you?
Sure. Well, I think part of it is the trade treaties requiring our partners that have low wages, Mexico is a good example, to change the rights of its own employees and its own population to raise the wages in that country. Then the other side of it is, it isn't simply, in my mind, industries where workers lost their jobs. It's whole parts of our country whose economic underpinnings were taken away. You know, small towns in the Midwest, up Missouri, they can't all be tourist destinations. And they were built around factories. And the way of life, not just of the workers, but of the restaurants, the entire communities, the professionals who live there, that's what's caused this backlash. And it's not just true here. A friend of mine from the Trade Union Unite in the UK, in the auto towns in the Midlands, despite the unions and the businesses arguing to stay in Europe, the workers voted for Brexit, to separate from the EU. And they did it because their belief was their way of life was under attack, was being destroyed. And so the question becomes, how do we raise wages for the people that exist, that remain in the United States, and how do we deal with the effect on those communities? So some of that can be done through trade treaties, and some of it, I'm afraid, is just public policy issues about education, about workers' rights to join unions. I know that's probably very popular in this room, but the idea that workers ought to have increased rights to raise their own wages and have some effect on that. So part of it is a combination of trade treaties and public policy. And until we do that, I think that this notion, and I know that every economist in America, maybe not everyone, Joe, but 98% of them, agree in this consensus of free trade. And I don't think that's about to change. But I do think that, last I checked, the economists don't hold that many votes in the presidential election. And as long as people are voting, I think public policy is going to have to reflect this issue of income inequality, which to me is the central theme of what we're really talking about, the result of trade and income inequality. We have to address that. Some of it's education, some of it's the right of workers to increase their own wages, and some of it is the incredible economic devastation of thousands of communities all across the United States that have no reason to exist anymore economically. And if we're going to ignore that and let the forces of the market determine it, those communities will be wiped out, and those people are not going to sit by and allow it to happen.
Yeah, but let me press you a little bit on one aspect of that, which, you know, I agree very strongly that the underlying problem is one of inequality, and we have to address the problems of inequality. And we could probably, if we have time, come back to talk about what we can do about it. But this panel, we're focusing on trade, and the question I want to ask is, or maybe two or three aspects of, do you think there is any trade agreement that could bring back manufacturing to those communities that you see as devastated? Is there any trade agreement that could do that?
Well, I would say that not in the massive numbers, you're right about that. But what I would say is, let's take, and I'm curious to the response from the governor from the auto industry, because my friends from the UAW would say that there's massive numbers of auto parts jobs that could and should be, because of the location close to the assembly plants, located in the United States, or at least in the US and Canada, that are now in Mexico. So a trade treaty that allowed wages to rise where they ought to rise in Mexico would bring back potentially tens of thousands of auto supply jobs that really more efficiently should be located near the assembly plants, which are located by and large here. So yes, I think there are some that would bring back numbers. Not answering the millions and millions of jobs, but it'll bring back tens of thousands of jobs and jobs that you can support a family by.
Matt, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So, I mean, just to talk about auto parts, you know, a lot of the content of a NAFTA-built vehicle today is from the United States. Every vehicle that Mexico exports has on average 40% US content, which is about half the value of a car. Every vehicle exported from Canada has about 70% US content. So there's a lot of US content in NAFTA-produced cars. In the Mexico example in particular, that's not just the cars they send to the United States, that's the cars they export all over the world. And Mexico has really done a great job becoming an export platform globally. So, you know, NAFTA has allowed a lot of US content to be in these vehicles. When you do the analysis, not much of it's from China, probably about 5% on average of the content of a NAFTA-produced vehicles from China. It's really allowed NAFTA, North America, the North American NAFTA region, to create vehicles and be competitive globally. And you've got a good mix, I think, in NAFTA of developing and well-developed economies. No question, I have no question that you can do a better job negotiating trade agreements. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I mentioned standards, and I think the Europeans do a great job pushing for acceptance of their standards. When the Europeans negotiated the EU-Vietnam trade agreement, they explicitly stated in the agreement that Vietnam would take cars that are built to EU standards. When the US did the TPP that included Vietnam, there was no mention of standards. So we can do a lot better job, I think, aggressively ensuring that we have the same sort of market access that our global competitors do. And there are pragmatic things you can do in trade agreements that address currency manipulation, that address standards, that address labor and environmental standards, that have a positive impact for the United States, and ultimately for our trading partners as well.
When you mention standards, one particular issue in auto that sometimes come up is that some countries want higher emission standards than us. And in a world of climate change, we are lagging, and he's proposed for us to lag even more.
Yeah, when I talk about standards, it's primarily talking about the safety standards and the differing safety standard systems. Certainly, sovereign nations have their own environmental and emission standards that manufacturers have become good at complying with.
Yeah. So, but also, when we're looking about the overall jobs issue, one of the questions in the way that the debate has been framed is it hasn't taken into account the nature of reciprocity in trade. And that if the United States starts having protectionism, others will respond. And that if we unilaterally increased our tariffs, say against China, it would respond almost surely in one way or another. Or maybe this is getting ahead of the story, but if we impose the border adjustment tax is part of the tax proposal, which would allow for tax deductive exports would not be taxed, and that imports would be taxed. Our trading partners have already made it fairly clear that they would respond. They would view that as a violation of WTO, and most people have said it probably is, and they would respond. So, viewing, particularly from the point of view of an export industry like yours, how do you see this threat of a trade war, and what will that do to American jobs?
Yeah, we see it already. I mean, I think that the conversation about what the future will likely have, and the automation, the robotics, and I agree with you on the policy decisions and the government really changing the math on whether jobs come back to the United States or not. I think it's not just a trade agreement, it's whatever the policies are really central, and I saw that with another industry with doing some work in China. But we're already seeing this occur right now in agriculture. Mexico, again, key trading partner, and they're already saying, they'll pull the nuclear option and not buy our corn or push back on dairy. The challenge right now is in long markets, there are other sources they could go to. And so even if you say, well, nothing has really changed as of yet, The reality is pricing dropped dramatically. I'll say in dairy powders, went from $1.05 to 80 cents. You mark to market. I mean, this is really hurting agriculture right now, and I talked about what happened in Canada. In corn, Mexico and different legislators are already coming back and saying, we will put forth legislation saying we will not purchase American corn. And where can they go? Well, they can go to a lot of different places around the world. We are the best producer, we believe, in agriculture, but they have other sources. You couple that with the strong dollar, right? So right now we are advantaged into Mexico because we don't have any tariffs from an agricultural perspective, and we're right there. But the reality is there is a strong dollar, there is a long market, there are other opportunities for them to access supply, and we see that in a competitive marketplace. This is a real challenge. So they can do a lot of different things from a trade policy perspective, and then other things that we talked about, or that I mentioned. They can change a class of ingredients to favor their own producer or processor, which is what has happened. It then means that volume is pushed back into the United States. So that's a significant issue right now, and it'll be a bumpy ride wherever the future is. When we talk about the future and the negotiations, there's a bumpy ride in the interim, and having a lack of certainty is killer for an industry. You can't make your capital investments. You don't know where to play because you aren't sure what the rules of the game are. And so I think that those are significant issues, and you can see the ways that they can push back into the United States for an industry like agriculture, where we are advantaged and we're a net exporter.
Yeah. Can I turn to you, Bruce, and ask one more question, which is, we've tried to create over the last 70 years a world in which borders didn't matter, or at least were much less important. People created, like you, global supply chains, some much more complicated than yours, but in autos, much more complicated goods go back and forth. One of the things that's concerned me is this unilateral action is a reminder that borders do matter. Our politics really do matter. And some people think that that will have long-lasting effects, that even if we navigate through this particular episode without a disaster, the fact is that everybody will have in the back of their mind that borders do matter and will be thinking twice as they restructure supply chains to think about what would happen if there were another character in another country that tried to interrupt it. You want to?
So 2 points. The government doesn't really recognize innovation like as a part of a product. So my industry, the houseware industry or consumer electronics, we innovate here, we export. I export to China, I export to Korea, I export to Japan, I export to South America, but the product is usually made in China. And the free trade agreements don't recognize that at all, which is an interesting thing. We were in Sweden at the council trying to do some business there, and we were there with the ambassador, and Apple, he was complaining, Apple Computer is not recognized by the US Chamber of Commerce because they are not a US manufacturer. So all the innovation that's done here is really not recognized. It's an amazing point. And my industry, again, $90 billion or so, 90% of the products are somewhere touched in a foreign country. Maybe it's a part, maybe it's the whole thing. So, and is exported all over the world, the innovation, the creativity of what this country does best. And that's what we are. A lot of these companies have focused on just R&D and innovation rather than opening up factories. That's given us a lot of free capital to innovate. I would have never been able to start my company if I had a bunch of machines, which I probably wouldn't have been competitive as I could be by buying product from around the world. Second point is the consumer is not polarized at all. The consumer wants the less expensive, the least expensive product. If I go to Target or I go to one of our retail partners and say, this is made in the United States, it's $14.95. This is made in a foreign country, and it's $9.99 or $12.99. What are they going to tell me? And I used to do this because we did really try to produce product. They will always go to the less expensive product. And that's what the consumer wants. That, at the end of the day, is what the consumer wants.
So there's a disconnect in this sense between the politics and their behavior in the marketplace.
Absolutely. Completely. I mean, the consumer clearly does not want to pay more for the product. The consumer wants to be free. So if the product's made in U.S. and it's better, that's great. That is fantastic. But that, you know, and that's a win. And we try to do that. But if the product is innovated and made better in China or Europe or wherever and brought here, and it beats the U.S. product, that's what the consumer wants. You see it in the auto industry, you see it everywhere. You see it in apparel. I mean, it's, so what would those duties do to the product, to the consumer? At the end of the day, it will just raise the price. The factories are just not here. Let's invest in innovation. Let's invest in making the best product. That's my point.
So, I mean, one of the things that some studies have pointed out is that the border adjustment tax that I described earlier, where the impact is very clear, it's on imported goods, will exacerbate the problems of the Rust Belt, because they import, if you look at their basket of goods that they buy, they're more reliant on these imports. And so it actually will increase inequality and lower their standards of living. At least that's a concern. Let me turn to you, Bruce, and ask a couple questions. You've heard, you know, the problem of place-based, the devastation in these areas. There is a particular problem that we talked about, that the job loss is also more concentrated in men, that women have been able to graduate from college and been able to adapt to the service sector, to the changing economy, and it's men that have not been able to do as good a job, and the broader issue of inequality. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, can I come back to planet Earth here and talk about economic determinism? I mean, talk about devastation. You go to rural America, there are ghost towns. They are a product of the disappearance of agriculture. In 1929, 35% of American families made their living off agriculture or providing services to agricultural families. That sector disappeared. It's gone. And it disappeared geographically just as it disappeared in occupations. But what happened was that the transition then was from decentralized agriculture to very highly centralized manufacturing. And there are two things that happen in manufacturing. And again, trade has very little to do with this. One is that when you have an integrated, centralized process, it's very hard to tell what individual contributions are. You can tell a rich farmer from a poor farmer. It's very hard to tell who on that assembly line is the good farmer and who isn't. And that has a huge leveling effect on wages. The second thing that happens, of course, is when you've got a centralized institution, those workers can organize. And so what you see in that first transition, which certainly moderates the effect to a great extent, is that there is much greater equality in wages and earned income that comes out of it, and that's a structural issue. When you go from manufacturing to services, you are going back to decentralized environments where individuals have identifiable products and they're very hard to organize together. And what they get paid for is their own performance. I just want to give you a sense of how far this has gone in the US economy and how much this discussion is about little parts of the economy that are going to get smaller later. One of the things we've been talking about, along with auto workers and factory workers, is coal miners. The total number of non-professional extractive workers in the United States is about 130,000 out of 160 million people in the labor force. The number of professional athletes in the United States is about 240,000. That is the economy you're living in, and those guys are service workers, and there is, of course, a huge dispersion in income among those service worker professional athletes. I don't think that 15, 20 years from now, we in the United States are going to notice the effect of any of these measures. And I go back to the transition out of agriculture. So I think that there are huge structural problems with the distribution of income, that at the margins, trade isn't going to affect them that much. And you've got to think about structural interventions like huge earned income tax credits to deal with them. And by the way, in your innovation, don't worry about the broomsticks. You'll have people in their living rooms with machines that make broomsticks in large numbers, and
Or
they'll
they have
deliver them
robotic
to you.
cleaning things all over.
But there won't be anybody running those machines.
Yeah. So there, let me try to put an argument that actually globalization has played a more important role in the growth of inequality, which I think is a key factor of the unhappiness that we have. And it goes back to a node proposition in standard trade theory, which is that trade in goods is a substitute for movement of people. So that, in fact, my teacher, Paul Samuelson, had a very influential paper called the factor price equalization theorem. And what it said is that if you had absolutely free trade, then unskilled workers, and technology was the same. So there are lots of assumptions that go in it, but it still had unskilled workers in developed, and as you open up trade, the wages of unskilled workers in the developed countries converges to the wages of workers, unskilled workers in developing countries. So that means the opening of trade does exert a downward pressure on wages. And what you see is not just, what you see if you look at the data, we're talking not just about the dispersion of wages that you were talking about, but if you look at the ratio of the hourly compensation of workers and their average productivity, historically, until the mid-70s, those two moved in tandem. And that what you see in the era after 1970s, and there's a big debate about what the causes of it, but after that era, beginning in the 80s, where there are lots of changes going on, including globalization, that productivity continues to grow almost unchanged, but average compensation adjusted for inflation basically stagnates. And so that's the gap that a lot of people are concerned about, and that is this downward pressure, at least in part, a downward pressure.
Right, but we disagree about the source of that. That's also the time when the service economy starts to become dominant.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's not inequality among different
No,
workers,
but again,
it's the average.
all right, so we had two panels up here where we had a very satisfied guy from the cable industry, and he's satisfied because cable is a local service monopoly. Monopolies make a lot more money. We had a guy come up here and talk about agriculture. Well, the company that's done extraordinarily well in the middle of an agricultural depression is John Deere, because they've gone from being a manufacturer to dominating the application of these innovations that got talked about in local geographies. They are 90% of the agricultural equipment in local markets because they have a service infrastructure, an intellectual infrastructure, a financing infrastructure, and a second-hand market infrastructure in those markets. I don't care what price Kubota tries to charge for a tractor, that's going to be a Deere market, and in the face of a huge drop in demand, they've been raising prices 3% a year. Services are also susceptible to local monopoly. And if you guys want to make money in this global market, Do what Deere has done. Concentrate on dominating local markets. And do what Liberty Global has done, concentrating on dominating local markets. I think these are fundamental economic forces, Joe. It's not about trade.
We have a number of questions from the audience for you all. Some questions regarding the border-adjusted tax. Do you think that it will pass, and what are you doing to prepare for it? I don't know if Governor Blunt, you want to take a stab at that? Or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what can pass and will pass in the Congress. But, you know, my personal opinion would be that the tax reform probably relies upon the border adjustment tax to occur. So if tax reform passes, the border adjustment tax passes would be my personal opinion, but that could turn out to be wrong.
So let me say, my view is that it's, the impact, the differential impact on importers and exporters is so large that you have a very concerted group of opponents. And with a very divided, you know, with the Senate, 52 seats, several of them from states where importers are very influential. And people worried about retaliation and the uncertainty that all of that will, I think, lead to strong opposition. Just for those of you following the debate, there are some economists who have argued that the exchange rate will rise, and so in fact, American exporters won't get any advantage, and American importers won't be at any disadvantage. But I think that argument assumes such extreme assumptions, including the fact that there would be no challenge of the WTO and that there would be no retaliation and no uncertainty. And the fact is, we know that all these things will be there, and so the exchange rate will not adjust fully, and so there will be these effects.
Now, I would argue that it's very unlikely the border adjustment tax has a chance of passing. The job losses in retail would be massive. Those are low-wage jobs. Be literally hundreds of American retailers that will go out of business with the border before the dollar has time to adjust, if it ever does, to do that. So I just can't conceive of it politically happening, nor do I think it's a good idea.
Bruce?
I've seen such grassroots effort in the last 2 months to oppose it. Every retailer, a lot of manufacturers, I just can't see it happening.
Beth?
This is,
I agree. I mean, yeah, for the reasons stated, I just don't see that occurring. And we've had a number of retailers in D.C. describing really what the real implications of that would be. I just don't see that occurring.
Can I just make one comment about political dynamics? One of the things that when you're doing reforms is you have to do them either very quickly, so people haven't gotten a chance to get organized in opposition, and the slow process here has been going the other way, or you do what President Reagan did, is that you wrap a tax reform around a corporate, he had an individual income tax reform and a corporate tax reform with some provisions that were so complicated that everybody could believe that it was a revenue-neutral tax reform in which everybody could believe that they were the winners. So if you make things sufficiently non-transparent, you can succeed in making most people believe they're winners. But in this particular case, it's been too transparent, and too many people believe that know that they're going to be the losers.
So we have a number of questions actually on the subject of income inequality, which was brought up. One question in particular asks what your views are on universal basic income, and whether it's a good idea, or alternatively, and more broadly, what is the long-term solution to the elimination of the value of unskilled labor, given what we've talked about previously? I don't know if anybody who wants to take a stab at this. Bruce Rayner?
Yeah, 2 points I would make. The fastest growing and one of the most essential occupations in America are home health care workers. As the population ages, we need hundreds of thousands more of those people. And what's more skilled than taking care of, with all due respect, some of us in this room will be people that
Speak for yourself. I'm easy to take care of.
So I think it's a highly skilled occupation. And the question becomes, as a society, are we going to value that and pay those workers decent money to take care of us? I think if we probably look, judging by the age of this group, if we had a vote, we'd probably vote a pretty decent wage increase here. But as a society, we've got to determine that. And that's a debate that's not happening. It's not part of the trade debate, but that's part of the debate that needs to happen. And then the second part is that I think workers have to be given a chance to raise their own wages. And the decline of collective bargaining and other mechanisms in our society to allow workers to have some say in what they get paid. We had this debate about immigration, and people say, well, American workers don't want to be gardeners. Well, try paying gardeners $20 an hour and see how many white American workers and black American workers would take those jobs. They don't want them at $7 and $8 an hour because they're hard work. Just like if you didn't pay construction workers a decent wage. So a lot of this has to do with how society values workers' wages. If we're going to deal with income inequality, we're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's many of the key service sectors that are expanding, care of the elderly, healthcare, and education, are really socially determined. The public provides a large part of the support for education, for healthcare, and for the care of the elderly. And that means the value of that is not just an ordinary market service, it's a societal value. And that's going to be affected by the tax system and how much we're willing to spend to support those activities, and that will determine the wage, and that will determine the respect that is given to those jobs. If they're low-paid jobs, they'll be given low respect, but if they're higher-paid jobs, I think they will be given more respect. The other policy that I think is very important is running the macroeconomy very tightly, and we haven't been running it as tightly as we should. By that I mean the one period in our recent history where we brought in marginalized groups that have not been part of our labor force, have not been part of our employment, is the late 90s, when we got the unemployment rate way down, and then employers found it worthwhile to hire groups that had previously been excluded from jobs. So if we want to deal with the problem of inequality, a tight labor market is one of the important things of driving wages up. And the final thing, in terms of the question of the universal basic income, the problem with that is it's a fixed grant to everybody. If we were a richer country, and it's a little bit hard to imagine what that means because we are one of the richest countries, but if we, maybe I should say a richer and less selfish country, we would be willing to tax more, and then we could say we could give everybody a fixed amount. Given the amount of money that we're willing to raise in taxes, I think we have to target the limited resources we have to the people who need it most. But the other tool that Bruce mentioned very briefly, and
yeah, can I talk about those?
Sure.
Because first of all, in the United States, if you go to a party and you see somebody and you say, who is that? And they say, that's the Duke of Devonshire. You say, oh, what does he do for a living? In Europe, you don't ask that. In the United States, work has, and I think it's because of the immigrant nature of the society, a particular value. I think you want to reward work. You don't want to just give out incomes. I think that's a cultural essential in the United States. That's why you want the earned income tax credit. I think you've got to be incredibly careful about making value judgments about who should get paid a lot for what jobs, because there are gender and other implications of this that have huge consequences. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the group that is getting slaughtered in the United States at the moment is high school graduate males. They have no sort of political standing, and their life expectancy is falling extraordinarily sharply. I think if you start valorizing certain professions, you will find that there are groups like that that get left by the side of the road, and you don't want to do it. Third, I don't think you want to fool around with minimum wages, because if you do that, the jobs are going to disappear with the high wages, especially in this world of automation. What solves all that is an earned income tax credit. You can do $9 an hour working on somebody's garden and do it for 1,000 hours a year, which is normally you work 2,000 hours a year. It's a 9,000 a year income. If we had an earned income tax credit that gave that person 2 times their earnings, that would be a $27,000 a year income. It could apply across jobs. The wage adjustments would assure the jobs were there, and you would do much better.
But the guy would do it, or a woman would do a lot better if they paid him $18 an hour to do that.
But they get 20.
And they wouldn't need the earned income tax credit.
Right, but the thing is that if
they
that
get
happened,
rewarded for what?
nobody's going to pay them. So you're going to have this notional wage of $27 an hour, and people are saying, oh, I'm not going to hire anybody at that. I'll have a Zumba that grows the lawn.
I would argue that all these Americans who like nice houses and nice lawns, if it cost them a little more to have those nice houses and nice lawns, would pay them. And it isn't they wouldn't all of a sudden become overrun because the gardeners required $18 an hour. I think it's called capitalism. I think it sort of works.
All right, I think that's why we have markets set wages. But if they're inappropriate, you want to fix them.
Alan Kruger is sitting in the audience here. He's done a lot of important work on the consequences of raising the minimum wage. And the evidence was that moderate increases do not result in any significant reductions in employment. Now, obviously, if you raised it
in the
4
short
times.
Run. In the short run. I mean, you didn't look over 20
ask.
years, did you?
We'll have an opportunity to speak with Professor Kruger about this in the next panel. We have a number of questions regarding the trade, not in goods, but the trade in information, data. And the questions pertain to how important is free trade in data and cybersecurity to your industries, and do you see threats going forward?
Well, certainly we, as an industry, we'd be opposed to any mandates on where data has to be stored and that sort of thing. So we think it's important to have free transfer of data as a part of trade agreements.
Let me just say, I mean, I think there's nobody here really representing the industries that are most involved. And, but there is a big split that is opening up between Europe and the United States on these issues. That over issues of privacy and security. And I think there are legitimate differences in views. I think at least most of the Europeans that I've talked to feel very strongly about privacy, and that they don't like the idea of automatically, or in some deceptive way, having somebody take away their data and market it. And sometimes some people from Silicon Valley, their interpretation is that's anti-Google or anti-Facebook. I think that's not. I don't think it's anti-American. I think it's just, and these are long-standing values that they've been concerned with about privacy that existed. They believe in transparency on the government, but privacy on the individual side. And I think we ought to recognize that as a legitimate set of values that people should be concerned with. And I think people in the United States, if they, ought to be more concerned about the use to which data, if it were, could be used as people can use that data to get a lot of individual information about you. And any of you who use Google and all of a sudden get these ads appearing feel a little bit queasy about Big Brother watching you all the time.
Unless you can sell a broom.
Do you see, so we have a question about relating the role of relating trade to some of the earlier issues we talked about with technology, and we sort of alluded to this. In the event that we see massive disruptions to trade, do you somehow see that potentially fostering domestic innovation? If cheap labor is no longer available abroad and it comes back, and so things have to be produced here, would that in some ways foster even greater innovation domestically to deal with that problem?
I don't know if it's greater innovation. I'm sure that's part of it. But we see it already. So I'm going to use, again, my example in the dairy markets. And immigration, and you talked about the gardener would do $9 if it was $18. You know, no labor rate, the wage rates of farm workers have increased even more dramatically over the last number of years than the normal workers. Still, it's very difficult to access workers, enough workers on farms. And so immigration reform has been a central issue. Interestingly enough, rural communities, which voted so strongly for this administration, I've talked about trade issues and immigration reform issues. Both are very significant concerns for farmers. How are we going to have enough labor, and what is our trade access? That's a big issue. So many of the farmers right now in the dairy sector are really talking about robotics as a way, from a milking perspective, that they can manage their operation. They have to think of that because of access to labor. It's not even just the wage rate itself, because they're willing to increase wages because they've been doing it. It is because they cannot access workers. They don't have enough immigration reform, and so they're going to have to move to robotics because, again, this is their livelihood and this is their way of life. This is about the strength of rural communities, and so they're going to have to do something to make a long-term investment so they can hand this over to their next generation.
Can I say that there are two actually effects going in different directions? One of the innovation is a fixed cost, and if you have a bigger market, you have a greater incentive to innovate. And I think globalization, by opening up markets globally, mean that if you come up with a better broom, you have a global market to sell it to. And
right, and if you cut off these countries that we produce, these lower cost countries, innovation will cost more around the world. That's a simple fact. I mean, the iPhone or my product or anything will have to go up in cost.
Or unfortunately,
that's one side that where closing down actually has a negative effect. The other side is the Scandinavian countries have felt, at least a lot of research there, has supported the view that the high wage economy, they have strong unions and they've pushed wages up, they've had wage compression, and they believe that it has, and there's a lot of evidence, it has strongly incentivized innovation, increasing labor productivity, and then the government keeps managing and keeps the economy at full employment and retraining the workers. And so they've succeeded in creating this high productivity, high wage, full employment economy that's very open. But the reason it's been so open is because they've created this greater equality, and so people aren't afraid of openness in the way that they've become afraid in the United States, because we basically, fundamentally didn't do anything about this growing inequality, and now we've gotten this backlash, which is totally understandable given what's happened to people.
We're unfortunately out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a very nice discussion.